Configuring caching. The goal of this nugget is simple. By the time you're done here, you will understand what caching is and how to set it up on ISA server. Because of that, we're only going to have about one conceptual slide that we'll take on the whiteboard, and that is a caching overview. How does ISA server handle caching? From there, we're going to get into the live interface and start setting up the caching policy and really look at some of the settings that we can use to configure features like active caching, where it goes out and caches content before it's able to expire. We'll then get into the cache settings. Now you might be thinking, what's the difference between configuring a cache policy and cache settings? Well, when I think of the settings, I think of kind of the advanced tweaks, the way to optimize caching in the most efficient method. Finally, we'll look at a feature that Microsoft has included in ISA server called scheduled content downloads. It allows you as an administrator to get proactive and tell ISA server to download content before maybe the rush of employees comes into the office. If you ask a network administrator how caching works, most of them will just say, well, we store web content locally, which is true, but that's like a 10,000-foot view of a process that is, in my opinion, pretty incredible. The ISA server is always being a proactive partner in your caching mechanism. Watch this. We've got this client PC, and it's going to nuggetlab.com. So it's going to come up here to the ISA server, because that's its default gateway, and say, I need this content. Now the ISA server will look in its cache, and if it's not there, it's going to retrieve that from the internet. Now when it comes back, the ISA server will initially store that content in its RAM. You notice that I have my RAM and hard disk breakouts of the ISA server. And cache content is stored in the memory. Now here's a tip for you. If you're looking for an incredible way to speed up your internet access, definitely load your ISA server up with a bunch of memory. The more memory it has, the more cache content it can store in there. And when you have cache content being accessed from the RAM, it's accessed like that, quick, lightning fast. So the clients will think, holy cow, our internet connection must be incredible because they're getting that content so quickly. Now the ISA server doesn't keep all of its content in memory. It also stores some of it on the hard drive. It's kind of like the magazines at my house. I have a ton of them. And some of them I read often, and some of them I don't read so often, and I leave them all around the house. My wife goes around and pretty much the saltwater fish magazines, she knows I read those all the time. That's my hobby. I'm kind of weird. Now the computer magazines, on the other hand, she says, oh, well, he browses these from time to time, and she puts them in my office. In the same way, the ISA server will move content that's not accessed so frequently out of the RAM into the hard drive. Now, if it sees that that content is being accessed quite a bit, it will move it back into the RAM where it can be accessed very fast. Now, we also have this directory file, which is stored in memory, and it is a listing of every piece of content that ISA server has in its cache. See, ISA server doesn't want to have to look into a directory of files or something like that every single time it needs to figure out if something is cached. Instead, it has a very quick access directory file stored in the RAM listing every single website that is cached in that directory file. Now, since it's in the RAM, what happens if the ISA server reboots? Well, directory file is gone. But thankfully, we do have a backup directory file sitting on the hard disk that can be copied to the RAM when ISA server restarts. Because if you lose that directory file, the ISA server will have no idea what it has in cache, and this will all eventually get emptied out. Now, when you look at the cache content on the hard drive, the ISA server does not maintain it all in a big directory of web pages. It actually maintains one single file per partition of cache content. That allows it to do its own indexing, its own defragmenting of that file. It keeps that file very efficient, but all of those web pages will be stored in a single file. Now, because the ISA server is keeping track of what content seems to be pretty popular, and it's keeping that in the RAM, what that leaves open is a feature called active caching. What that does is it allows the ISA server to proactively update cache content that it considers popular without it ever being accessed. Here's what that means. Cached content will eventually time out. It has a time to live, and eventually it has to be dumped or refreshed. Now, you don't want the cached content reaching its time to live and being dumped, especially if it's a lot of it, during your peak hours. So what can happen is right before your peak hours, ISA server can track this, it can go out and update that cached content and make sure its time to live is refreshed right before everybody accessed it. That's one of the cool features included in ISA server. It also has the ability to do content prefetching, which allows you as the administrator to have control and say, well, at 7:55 a.m., I want you to go out and download all the news websites because everybody accesses the news as soon as they get in at 8. So you can have the ISA server proactively go out and cache that information at specific times. Now, imagine this. This client, instead of going to nuggetlab.com, goes to amazon.com, and they purchase their favorite book. They type in their credit card information into a web page. Now, will that be cached and stored on the ISA server? Could that be some security holes? The answer is no, most likely. Now, wait a sec. Most likely? What does that mean? Well, first off, this is known as HTTP caching, not HTTPS caching. Any web page that has security enabled will not be cached. And most websites that have credit card information able to be stored will have security of some form being turned on. But let's say it's not. Let's say it is an HTTP website and they're allowing you to type in your credit card information. Can we dictate that it's not cached then? Well, you can, and there's a few ways to do it. First off, the web administrator out on the internet can type into the HTML code some commands that dictates to the ISA server or any caching server or client, because Internet Explorer can cache as well. It can dictate to that client, do not cache this web page. It's known as cache control code in the HTML header. Now, also, you as an ISA server administrator can dictate on the ISA server that certain websites can't be cached. For instance, if you know of a few websites that are being used that have unsecure credit card entries, and this kind of sounds crazy as I'm talking about it because there's not any websites that I know of, but you could type them in to the ISA server and tell the ISA server not to cache those. So there are very, very few security concerns when you're thinking about caching. All right, let's go ahead and start configuring this on our ISA server. Okay, here's how you set this up. I'm going to expand the ISA Management Console and expand the ISA server. And underneath we'll see the cache configuration. Now I'm going to expand this. However, to configure the cache configuration, the major settings, you're going to right-click on it and go to the Properties. Inside, you'll initially see all the cache storage space that you have set up on this server. Now, when we installed ISA server, we set it up to have 100 megabytes of cache. This is an unusually low amount. However, in the real world, you would actually set this up in the gigabyte ranges, depending on the size of your company. The first one we want to set up is the HTTP caching. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is since we installed this as a caching server, it is enabled by default, and it says unless the source specifies expiration, update the object in the cache, and then you have your 4 options. Let me explain these. If you choose frequently, you notice that you can kind of see it in the grayed out behind here. It says, I will never cache content. It says no less than 0 minutes in age and no more than 0 weeks in age. Overall, frequently will immediately expire your cache content as it's downloading unless the source specifies an expiration date. Here's the idea. As a website administrator, you could code what the expiration date of your web content is. For example, maybe you have a website that you've set up and you change it once a week. Well, you could code in the HTML header that this will expire a week from, and then the date that you have in there as well. Now, not many website administrators do that, so if you choose frequently, expect that your caching will be kept at a minimum. Most things will be retrieved from the internet. Normally, which is checked by default, allows you to have HTTP caching in kind of a balanced setting. You will retrieve some from the internet. However, some of it you will retrieve from the cache. And look at this. This kind of spells it out. First off, let me click this so we can read it without it being gray. It says this percentage of content age, 20%, since creation or modification. What this means is that the cache stored on your ISA server will be stored 20% of the age since it was created. So if it was created 100 days ago, and this is noted in the HTML header, if it was created 100 days ago, it will be stored maximum 20 days, or in this case, no more than 1 day. See, this is how it works. It will store the percentage since it was creation, so either 20 days if it was created 100 days ago, or these items overrule. No less than 15 minutes will it ever be in the cache, and no more than 1 day will it ever be in the cache. That is what normally will set up for you. So if, for example, the content was created 10 seconds ago, that would end up timing it out after about 2 seconds, and it would only be valid for 2 seconds. However, this will overrule and say that this can be cached no less than 15 minutes, and that will end up remaining for 15 minutes in the cache. Now, less frequently, we'll cache items longer. You see that it goes up to no less than 30 minutes or no more than 2 days. Then, of course, you can set your own caching by typing in a specific percentage. You could say, I want 50% of the content age, or no less than, and you have your options here, no less than, you could get crazy, no less than 30 weeks. The idea is you want to try and find a balanced amount. And most people, most network administrators, will choose to go with the normal style of caching on this tab. Now you'll notice that up here we also have an FTP tab. Yes, ISA Server allows us, and by default does cache FTP objects. These are files that you download from an FTP site. And by default, the time to live for FTP, all FTP objects, is going to be 1440 minutes. Let's see, divide that by 60, carry the 1, that's 24 hours. So FTP objects will be cached by default for 24 hours. Why they didn't put 24 in here instead of the 1440 is beyond anyone. However, I would say it would be safe, just a suggestion, it would probably be safe to crank that up even more, maybe even 48 hours or beyond. The reason why is FTP objects hardly ever change. I mean, these are zip files, and if the file name stays the same, most likely the object will stay the same. So you could even get this into the weeks if you wanted to, and I think you would still be safe, unless you found that people were downloading content or FTP files that were constantly changing all the time. Now, the configuration of active caching is a little odd. Let me explain. First off, active caching updates files that are stored in the cache as the time to live is about to expire. So if it's a frequently accessed file, you don't have to wait for it to expire, a client to access it to be re-downloaded. ISA Server can recognize it, go, oh, that's accessed all the time, I need to update it. Go out, update that on its own, and take care of it when the bandwidth requirements are fairly low. The reason I say it's a little odd is because this is how you enable it. You check the box, and you have retrieve files in one of 3 options: frequently, normally, and less frequently. Overall, frequently is going to be the top performance for the client because the items in the cache will most often be up to date. Less frequency means that it won't update them as often. Some of the things may time out, but the very popular web pages that are stored will be updated. Now this is why it's a little odd. As a network administrator, what does frequently mean to me? What does less frequently mean to me? I want a time, I want an algorithm, I want something to go by. Unfortunately, the algorithm for active caching is completely undocumented by Microsoft. However, I've done a little research, and what I've found out is it works kind of like SETI. You ever heard of this program SETI? It's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's a screensaver that installs on your computer that when your processor cycles are fairly low, it goes out and downloads extraterrestrial files from the internet and tries to find them in the galaxy. Well, this works in a similar fashion. When your processor cycles are low on the ISA server, it pretty much assumes that network activity is low. So that's when it will go out and actively cache the files. When it's frequently, it will update as many of them as it can while the processor cycles are low. Less frequently, will go out and wait a longer time before it actually starts updated. Wait for the processor to be idle for quite some time. So it's not really something you can put your thumb on. That's the term I'm looking for. But overall, active caching is very helpful because it does save you plenty of bandwidth. Let's take a look at this Advanced tab, and you'll see just how tunable ISA server really is. These are all the, I guess, tweaking options of the cache that you can get in and get down and dirty with what exactly caching is going to be doing. First off, do not cache objects larger than blank. If you want to limit how large an item in your cache can be, you can check this box and specify the size. Most of the time you won't have to. So overall, the default is okay. By the way, this is the defaults that you see on the screen. But you can limit the size to, let's say you have a lot of people downloading big pictures, so you might say 500 kilobytes is the limit of an object in the cache. And you can get even larger. You can get into the megabytes or even the gigabytes. And I have yet to see a web page or an object downloaded from the web that gets into the range of gigabytes, but could happen. We also have cache objects that have an unspecified last modification time, and that is checked by default. Now, if you remember back to the first tab, HTTP, one of the things that it uses to calculate how long the time to live of any object in the cache would be is the last modification time. It says, well, based on when this page was last modified, it will stay in the cache this long. Now, some pages may not have a last modification time. If you uncheck this box, it will not cache those. However, most of the time it's safe to cache those. It's especially safe to cache those because normally those don't change. It's the ones that do have modification times that change all the time. Cache objects, even though they do not have an HTTP status code of 200. Now that's a cryptic one. Overall, HTTP status code 200 is okay. If you access a website and everything downloads okay, you get a status code of 200. So what this is saying is cache objects, even if they don't come down okay. This is a symptom known as negative caching. You ever gone to a website where the server is down and you're sitting there and it's loading. It probably loads for about a minute and then finally comes back and says, oh, page could not be found, or server is unavailable, or some message like that. Well, if you keep this checked, ISA server will cache those web pages. So the next time somebody accesses that website, they won't get that loading. It'll be an instantaneous, oh, page not found. Sorry, server is down. Now that's good most of the time, because usually if something's down, it's going to be down for a while. Where this one becomes negative, I guess it's kind of redundant because it's called negative caching. Where this becomes a problem is if you have a website that comes up before the time to live expires on that negative cache, then it will be telling you it's down even when the web server is up. So kind of weigh and balance on this one. It's on by default, but in my experience, I've actually unchecked this in a number of occasions. Cache dynamic content. Dynamic content is pages that are generated dynamically, such as when you go to msn.com. It lets you customize it and type in your zip code so you can get your local weather and your local news, and you can even type in your own stock quotes that you want to get on that web page. Now, that is considered a dynamic web page because it's generated just for you. Now, I would say in less than 3% of the cases is caching dynamic content useful, because it's hardly ever reused. It's always changing. It's always being modified depending on what web browser is accessing it and the time of day. So it would be a rare occasion that you would actually choose to cache dynamic content. Most of the time, the default of leaving this unchecked is just fine. Maximum size of the URL cached in memory in bytes. This is how much an individual URL can store in memory. For instance, if I go to yahoo.com. You remember before that the cache is stored in memory and on the hard drive. Well, by default, it will only store about 12.8 kilobytes in the memory. I would say nowadays it's safe to increase that with something like this, 128 kilobytes. The reason I say that is because web pages have grown so much, even in the last couple of years. Dynamic content and large graphics and high-speed internet connection has really cranked up the size of these web pages. So this is the maximum size an individual URL can store in the memory, and I would say it's safe to keep it around 128 kilobytes as long as you have a decent amount of memory in the ISA server. And when I say decent, I usually mean a gigabyte or more of memory. If a website of expired object cannot be reached, do you A, not return the objects, or B, return an expired object? Here's what this means. Let's say you went to yahoo.com and it cached that information, and then Yahoo's server went down. They're inaccessible. You could still get the Yahoo web page from the cache, but if the time to live expires, is it still valid? Well, by default, it will be. It will be for less than this percentage of the original time to live. This gets really confusing when you think about it, so let me give you an example. Let's say the time to live on the Yahoo web page was 12 hours. Well, it went down, and 12 hours later, the cache expired. Someone then went to access it. With this setting, it's going to keep it 50% longer than the time to live. So, in essence, an additional 6 hours on top of the 12 time to live that it was originally in there. However, that's limited by this one down here, as if it wasn't convoluted enough, but no more than 60 minutes by default. So overall, we could have returned it for up to 6 hours, which is 50% the time to live, but we're going to limit it down to 1 minute, 60 minutes in this case, because that's going to tie it down to no more than 60 minutes. Finally, we have the percentage of free memory to use for caching. In this case, up to 50% of your free memory will be used to store cached files. If you open Performance Monitor and you're tracking your memory and noticing that it never really gets above a certain amount, then it would be safe to increase this. However, if you're noticing that in Performance Monitor all your physical memory is being used up and it's starting to use the page file, I would almost say to decrease this because it's hurting your server performance. We'll talk more about using Performance Monitor to monitor and optimize ISA server in a future nugget. But these are the advanced options that you can apply to make ISA server cache exactly how you want it to. And you now know just about everything of ISA server caching. There's just a few more things I want to show you. Let me show you first off how to change your cache configuration based on the storage space if you need to. You click on the drives, and if you want to change what your cache size or what drives it's using to cache, you just double-click this ISA server. And you remember this screen. This is going to list all the drives you have in your ISA server, how much free space they have, and then how much cache size it has. So if you want to increase it, just type in the new number, hit set, and you're done. It will ask you to restart the services, which will need to take place before the caching will update and use that extra storage space. And as long as people aren't currently accessing the internet or using the ISA server, it's okay to do that. The final topic is going to be the scheduled content downloads. This allows you, as the administrator, to specify exactly what will be downloaded from the internet and when. All you need to do is right-click on these scheduled content download jobs and hit New Job, and it's going to come up with, go figure, another wizard. It's going to say, what is the job name? And we'll say, I want to cache CBT nuggets. Hit Next. From there, it's going to say, what is going to be the start date to begin downloading? Now, if this is a one-time scheduled content job, you can type in that date and time now. But most likely, this is going to be a reoccurring thing. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't create a whole scheduled job just for a one-time download. We'll say that the date we'll start it on is, we'll throw it out in December of 2004, December 1st. And we'll say the time is going to be 6:26 p.m. That's a perfect time. Hit Next. From there, it's going to say, what do you want to do? Do you want to download the content just once on that date? Do you want to download it daily, every single day at that time? Or do you want to download it every week on these certain days? So you'll specify exactly when and where you want to download this content and hit Next. Now, again, let me get back to this date. You'll have to do some planning for this, and this is going to require some analysis to realize that, hey, everybody in my company seems to access CBT Nuggets at 6 o'clock every evening. So this is going to take a little analysis, so you'll have to know what's being accessed when, and we'll talk about, again, that optimizing and analyzing in a future Nugget. I'll hit next, and it'll say, what is the URL you want to download from? In this case, we'll go ahead and type in HTTP www.cbtnuggets.com. Now down here, there are some key checkboxes, this and the next screen. First off, I almost always check this first one. Content only from this URL domain, not to sites from which it links. Save the hard drive space. The little flag waves in the air. Overall, if you do not check this, it will download cbtnuggets.com and any website CBT Nuggets links to. Now maybe CBT has links to Microsoft.com and Cisco.com for extra research for the students. Can you imagine the impact on your memory and your hard drive space if you decided to download the entire Cisco and Microsoft website? I couldn't imagine it. That is literally gigs and gigs of data that you would probably run out of space. So I would definitely make sure you check that first one. The second one is if you want to cache dynamic content from CBT Nuggets. These override your default cache settings that we just specified. So if you want to say for this website dynamic content's okay, then you can do that. Hit next. You have a few more options. We can override the time to live settings that we specified as well. First off, we have the checkbox. Always override the object's time to live. So if CBT Nuggets is specifying time to live on their web pages, you can override that with your own custom value down here. And we can say all the CBT Nuggets content will have a time to live of about 600 minutes, and we'll override that. We can also override the time to live if it's not defined by CBT Nuggets. So that's our options to override our time to live settings. We also have the links depth. Again, something I would highly recommend that you use, especially for large websites. This is how deep is it going to dig inside of the website. If I were to click around on every link and every web page inside cbtnuggets.com, by default, every single one of them would be cached. There is no maximum depth. If we check this box, we get to say the number of levels that we want to go into it. And when I say levels, think of the web page. When you first arrive there, you have the web page and an initial set of links. You click that set of links and you go to another level, one level down. Then you go to another level once you click links on that page, and so on and so forth to get deeper and deeper into the website. So this is kind of how many layers do you want to carve out of that website and pre-cache. I usually find if you go more than 2 to 3, you start getting a lot of content unless you have a very specific reason for doing so. You can also limit the number of cached objects. This right here, by default, is the maximum number of cached objects that you could specify. You can't go any larger than that. But if maybe CBT Nuggets has a lot of objects, a lot of graphics, and you only want to cache 10 of them, you can go ahead and type that in here as well. So again, totally customizable based on what you want from that website that you're downloading from. You hit next, it gives you a summary screen, and finish. That will store that scheduled content download job, and it's going to run the first time when we get to December 1st, 2004, 6:26 p.m., downloaded weekly from there. And you can see the dates that I've selected. So this is pretty much the final piece of the cache configuration that you can specify. So in this nugget, we have gone over a caching overview, how ISA Server handles caching. I think by now you realize it's a little more than storing web content locally. We've talked about configuring the initial cache policy where we can set up HTTP and FTP caching. And we also got into caching or configuring the advanced cache settings, getting down and dirty and saying, you know what, I want to set specific times to live, or I want to limit the size of downloaded content to this, all of those dynamic settings that we can specify. And finally, we just spoke about configuring the scheduled content download so that you can download web content when you choose to. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.